All right, thanks very much, everyone. Welcome back. Danny, thank you for the introduction and the invitation, and congratulations. I think it's been a really successful workshop, really good turnout. So as Danny said, I was invited really because I think everyone else was busy. But I've done a lot of work over the last few years up in Scotland at the University of Stirling and Scottish Institute of Sport, working using TMG in an applied setting and really putting it through its paces from a point of view of practical application. So just a little bit about the University of Stirling. If you've never been, I'd recommend visiting. It really is a lovely campus, beautiful part of the world. We call ourselves up there the Physiology, Exercise and Nutrition Research Group, and we like to practice what we preach a little bit. So, we go out walking in the hills, we do a little bit of tandem cycling racing around Scotland. It gets a little bit competitive, as I'm sure you can imagine. But if you are coming to Scotland, make sure you bring a coat, because this was just last week. It does get quite chilly up there. So, can I just kind of get a show of hands? Anyone that currently works with athletes in any kind of field, so not research necessarily, but people that actually work in an applied setting. Do we have many people in the room? Yeah, a few, a smattering. Okay, that's good, cool. So I guess the story that I'm going to tell today is really about the journey we've been on in establishing TMG as part of the support network for the athletes that we work with. Now, Sergey gave a great demonstration earlier of the exact way that TMG can work very well with athletes, with members of the public in a clinical setting. I wouldn't necessarily say we've followed that exact route to the letter. We've had a little bit of trials and tribulations along the way, and I'll try to pass on some of my anecdotes and some of the things that I've learnt along the way. Just before I get into that, it would be remiss of me not to just give a summary, a very brief overview, because this has already been covered, but just to remind everyone, or just in case anyone was late, the schematic should be fairly familiar. Our electrical stimulator, we get a single pulse to make the muscle contract. We measure that contraction. What's great from a sporting point of view, in an applied setting, is that feedback from the muscle we get in real time on the monitor. So straight away, there's no hanging around, there's no taking away and processing the data at length. The information appears on the screen for the athlete or for the coach immediately. Now, the way it works, as Sergey has already described, we measure the change in the muscle from its relaxed state to its contracted state using this sensor here. So in layman's terms, because working with athletes, I like to do things in layman's terms, we're measuring how much the muscle bulges. Simple as that. We can use terms like tone, we can use words like displacement, contraction time, velocity, all these kind of things. We are measuring the bulge of that muscle. Now, what that gives us is an output that looks a little bit like this. Now, this doesn't look as pretty as the ones that Sergey was showing us earlier, because this is an example from the older version of the software, which is the one that I started using about 4 years ago when I began working with the Institute. And from that output, we get these parameters. Again, you're very familiar with these by now. We could do a little quiz and see who remembers which ones, but I'll save everyone the embarrassment of doing that. Contraction time, displacement, there are two key measures. Okay, they're our most important ones, and throughout this presentation, they're the ones that I'll refer to most regularly, because they are the ones that matter the most to us, if I'm being honest. Sustained time, half relaxation time, time delay, they're all there. We get the information, it's there, it's accessible, but generally we don't tend to rely on that overly in the work that I do. Now, another parameter that hasn't been mentioned yet and started to appear more recently in the research, although Max did actually touch on it, if you remember the very first paper, which was by Valencic and Knez. Did I say that right, Knez? Yeah. So back in 1997, they measured velocity rather than contraction time. And this measure of velocity has started to appear in research. Sometimes it's referred to as normalized contraction response. Sometimes it's normalized response speed. Various different names, but effectively it's a measure of distance over time, a velocity measurement. So it's displacement over time, millimeters per second or per millisecond. And I tend to use this a little bit because translating it to a coach, to an athlete, makes a little bit more sense to them. describing the velocity of the muscle, just makes it that little bit easier for them to understand what you're telling them rather than talking about contraction time. Effectively, the two together give us fairly the same information. Now, Sport Scotland, Scottish Institute of Sport, we have this ethos, this, if you like, this mission statement to use cutting-edge technology and innovation in order to support athletes meet the specific needs of different athletes in different sports. Now, the Institute of Sport, as a branch of Sport Scotland, supports a wide variety of athletes across a whole range of sports. This is just a small example, but you can see a wide array of sports, and you can imagine different needs, the different requirements of athletes in these different sports. Swimming, very, very different from judo, very, very different demands from hockey, for example. Gordon Reid, wheelchair tennis player, very different demands placed on his body compared to Ben Kilner, who's a freestyle snowboarder. Now, since 1998, when the Institute was set up, the support has led to creating, or to helping to create, I should say, 18 Scottish world champions. There have been 36 Olympic and Paralympic gold medalists, 12 European gold medalists, and 69 Commonwealth Games medalists. So we do have a successful breed of athletes up in Scotland, and the Institute support is key to that ongoing success. Now, what can TMG bring to all these different athletes here in order to answer their specific needs? Again, we've already seen this study. Max summarised this study very nicely. This was from, I want to say, Boštjan Siminic's lab. I'm checking with Max, and he's nodding. So, yeah, Boštjan Siminic, oh, it says it there. Boštjan Siminic's lab. I did make the slides, I promise. And we can see that muscle fibre type composition can be measured very accurately using our TMG in a non-invasive way without the need for biopsies. What does that give us from an athlete's point of view or a coach's point of view? Well, we can make informed recovery decisions. If we know that an athlete is predominantly type 1, slow twitch, fibre-based, we know that they are going to be very suited to endurance-based activities, and their recovery is going to be very, very different from someone who is built for power and built for speed and very type 2 dominant. Can also help to inform training decisions. And this might even come in at the athlete talent identification stage, where we can try to point athletes in the right direction for what's going to be most suitable for them going forward in order to have a successful career. Now, we can also determine what we can call muscle contractile profile. And again, Sergey demonstrated this very nicely in his presentation earlier, and I've just shown a brief summary here. We might see that some muscles are a little bit on the slow side and need a little bit more focus on activation type exercises. We might see that some are a little bit too tight, need some stretch activity to try and loosen those muscles off, to try and bring the body into better balance. And this allows what I've referred to as targeted interventions. Really, the whole point is trying to get away from this one-size-fits-all approach. Okay? One size certainly does not fit all. Every athlete is different. And whether we talk about science and research or whether we're talking about elite sport, every single athlete is an individual and will respond in a very different way because their bodies are very, very different and their requirements might be extremely disparate to someone who's competing at exactly the same level in exactly the same sport. Now, another thing we can look at is our levels of symmetry. Again, we've heard about our symmetry already today. The potential injury risk involved in being imbalanced, one side being stronger than the other, one side being faster than the other, more powerful than the other. Also allows for movement balance. In a sport like swimming, where you're using your entire body to propel yourself, having a nice balanced symmetry from left to right side, it's going to make that job a lot easier to move you through the water. We also get our functional symmetry. And again, this comes down to injury risk. It also comes down to the efficiency of movement. Sergey spoke about antagonist-agonist relationships and about synergist groups and the ratio of muscles within that group and how they all respond and how they work together. Getting down to target individual muscles can help to really optimize any athlete's performance. Now, we've spoken about injury risk of asymmetry, and of course, injuries happen, rehabilitation. We can use TMG to track that, to assess rehabilitation strategies. We can do a little bit of trial and error. Using tensiomyography, it's non-invasive, takes no time at all, Best of all, athlete doesn't have to do anything. They just lie on a bed. And you'll see from Sergei's demonstration, there's no effort required whatsoever from the person who's having the TMG measurement done on them, performed on them. So we can be a little bit more test-retest with tensiomyography than we would be with functional tests that require effort, that require motivation, that actually might end up fatiguing the individual more just by performing the test. We can also use it as an objective marker for return to play. Is this athlete ready to return to the field? Athlete says yes, physio says maybe. TMG doesn't lie. Okay, the TMG is completely non-biased and completely objective. Finally, we can measure fatigue. Some of our work that we've done up in Stirling ourselves showed this decreased displacement following a period of fatigue, following electrical stimulation to induce the fatigue, and it correlated very nicely with changes in MVC, with changes in passive muscle tension. So we know that we can track fatigue in a very, very controlled manner using tensiomyography. This can be used to assess the status of athletes and can track recovery following specific events and specific competitions. Now, a coach wants all of that information. They want it here now, they want it yesterday, to be honest. But before we do any of that, the first step has to be to get an athlete profile. We need to know what that athlete should look like, what we want them to look like, before we can try and answer any of these questions. It's very easy to spot the Scottish swimmer in a swimming pool. Now, I'm just going to show you a brief summary of some of the muscles that we look at within swimming. As Sergei said, any peripheral or superficial muscle we can measure. So we measure just about everything that we can. We then decide which are the most important muscles, which are the ones we're likely to track across time that are going to give us the best, the clearest overview. And these are some of the ones that we look at in swimming. We look at the medial gastrocnemius, vastus lateralis, bicep femoris. We look at latissimus dorsi as well. Okay? Some upper body measures are important in swimming. Now, after we've performed our profile, we get a look at each muscle, we get a look at the symmetry of those muscles, and we can put that together to form a nice little picture of what our athlete looks like from a muscle contractile standpoint. Now, as I said, one size doesn't fit all, different strokes for different folks, and different sports have different requirements. So any new sport that tensiomyography is being implemented in, we need to identify what are the key muscles. What are going to be the most important muscles to look at? Because we're always against time. There's always a time constraint. And the measures can be done very quickly. You know, 1 minute to get one muscle is probably about standard. But sometimes all you have is 1 minute. So which one muscle are you going to look at? What are the key questions that you're trying to answer? Does it relate to recovery? Does it relate to fatigue? Does it relate to training adaptation? And again, this informs that key muscle decision. But regardless of what muscles, regardless of what questions you're looking at, the first step remains the same. You need to get this profile of your athletes so that you know what they look like, what you expect them to look like. Now, here's a summary again. Sergei has shown something very similar. Here's a summary of the main lower body muscles that we might look at. I've left off the glute max here, mainly because a lot of the athletes that I work with are female, and it's a little bit awkward to measure their glutes when you don't know them that well. After we've got our profiles for each athlete, we can put them together in a squad. Now, as Sergei said, each sport has a database that exists of reference material. Now, we can compare our squad averages to the reference averages. How does our squad match up with other squads? And we can see, for example, the Scottish hockey girls team, ladies team I should say I suppose, Scottish hockey ladies team have greater muscle tone down the lower limb posterior chain than the reference data. Now, the reason for that, we think, is because they do put a lot of emphasis in the strength and conditioning into targeting hamstrings, plantar flexors, because there's been a history within that squad over the previous years of injuries to hamstrings and plantar flexors. So a targeted decision was made to really train those muscles, really focus on those from a strength and conditioning standpoint, and that then ties in, makes sense that those muscles will be tighter than the reference values. So we're quite happy with that. It may be that we look at the reference values and see that our squad is disparate in some other way, and that then becomes a question we need to answer. Why is that happening? Is that desirable? Now, what's great, once we've got our squad averages, we can get new athletes coming into the program. We can assess them straight away. Some of these athletes are coming in aged 17, 18. They've never seen a gym in their life. They've never done any structured S&C work. They've done training for their specific sport. They've done skill work, but they've never actually worked on strength, conditioning, physiological changes. So we can see where they fit in relative to our squad, where we want them to be, and what changes we need to try and implement to put them up to the level that we want. So we can almost create a template for what we think is our ideal athlete in that sport. And we can mould new athletes coming into the program to try and target the key muscles to move them towards that template. Now, what's more challenging is when you have an athlete who's been involved in the system for a number of years, perhaps their late 20s, 30s. They've been training for a long, long time, and they're very different from your template for your ideal athlete. And the question then becomes, do we want to try and change them into an ideal athlete? They might already be very, very successful. Could making those changes at that stage in their career potentially be stepping them backwards in order to step them forwards? Do they have time in their career to step backwards in order to step forwards? So judgment calls have to be made depending on the individual, depending on where they are in their career, depending on what their training history is. Now, Max already summarised this paper that he authored himself up with some of my colleagues up in Stirling. And as highlighted, the fatigued and exercise state muscles actually show greater reliability than rested state over this longer period, this longer term stability measurement. So most of the measurements we do with athletes are in an exercise state. It's very rare that any of our athletes actually have long periods where they haven't done any training and they're well rested. So picking them up after training is probably more beneficial than picking them up before training because we're going to get more stable measurements. But still, there's going to be a bit of variation, a bit of variety. So how do we combat that? Well, in our profiling stage, we don't just do one measurement. We get a measurement in the muscle, left and right side. We measure it again. We measure it again. And we can see the reliability of that particular individual for that particular muscle. In this case, with swimming, what we did was 3 measurements on 3 consecutive weeks. So we got them the same time of day on the same day of the week to try and keep everything as similar as possible. The nature of their training cycle meant that the training they'd done on each day before the measurement wasn't exactly the same. But that was okay for us because we didn't want the measurements to be exactly the same. We wanted to see what the range was. We wanted to see how much we would expect them to change from week to week, day to day, month to month. We got this across all our muscles, and you can see quite clearly that some are very stable. Vastus lateralis here, nice stability, not a lot going on there. Gastric medialis, a little bit more variation. Bicep femoris, huge variation. Down here, latissimus dorsi, actually generally very stable, but for some reason, one of the measurements showed quite a bit of change. What happened on that day? Were they injured? Were they carrying some kind of knock? Was there a specific action done in the training that targeted that particular muscle? Okay, these are the kind of questions to answer when building up our athlete profile. But once we get these measurements, we get an idea of the variability of each individual, we can then take it and work out what our normal range might be expected to be. So we take the mean of our 3, could be more, could be 4, could be 5, could be an infinite number of measurements. We take our mean and then we work out a range. And what we've used for the range, because we found that it gives us an appropriate sized range, is the coefficient of variation, which is sometimes referred to as the relative standard deviation. Okay? So that gives us a range which is not so small that they're constantly shifting outside it, and not so wide that even when they're extremely fatigued, they're still within their normal range. Now, I've put the question here, what would cause an individual to fall outside their normal range? This was a fun little experiment we did. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a study because it wasn't overly well controlled, but we got one of our swimmers, did his normal training session. It was a session that specifically targeted the legs. He did a lot of work with his kickboard. This was a back crawler, and it was his hamstring, his bicep femoris we looked at. We then got an elite sports scientist, you can guess who that was, did the same, more or less, training, and you can see quite clearly, from pre to post, very little change going on in our well-trained, well-conditioned swimmer. Our somewhat less well-conditioned sports scientist drastically changed. Now, clearly the conclusion is that I worked much, much harder than the swimmer, but also we could conclude that our swimmer, our well-conditioned athletes, don't show massive fluctuations just because of training. Their bodies are well-conditioned and well-trained to cope with the training loads that they go through. So what we did next was tracked individual athletes across 3 consecutive days, and we got them pre and post every training session. So we ended up with, over the 3 days, about 12 measurements. And hopefully you can see in the light here, our norm range in the dotted grey lines are here, and our dotted black line is the mean here. Now, most of these measurements fall within the normal range. So the training hasn't knocked them outside of their normal range. There's nothing to worry about. But there are 1 or 2, and if I just clean it up by removing all the ones that were within our range, we can see these 4 fall outside what this athlete would normally be considered their standard range for that muscle. And we can start to see patterns emerging. If we highlight these 2 at the top, the displacement's a little bit high. So that means that the muscle tone is a little bit on the low side. These 2 measures were both done pre-training, AM, in the morning. So first thing in the morning before any exercise, any warm-up, any activation, this swimmer comes in and his muscle tone is a little bit on the low side at that time in the morning. These 2 here, the displacement actually is fine. It's within that normal range, but the contraction time, the velocity, is a little bit faster than would normally be expected. So what's happened here? Well, these are in the afternoon, and again, they're pre-training. So they're before he's done anything, but now in the afternoon, having done a training session in the morning, his muscles are firing just that little bit faster, twitching just that little bit faster. So this allows coaches to make decisions, inform training protocols, in order to train the athlete at a specific time that works for them. It might also feed into competition. When is the best time to race? What's the best thing to do in the morning if you're racing in the afternoon? What's the best thing to do in the morning if you're competing in the afternoon? If you're playing in the evening, what do you need to do earlier in the day in order to try and make sure that your muscles are in the best state they can possibly be? And we can see that the demand from competition is far, far greater than the demand from training. So here we have pre and post warm-up, very little change. Post-race, we get a massive decline in displacement. So the muscle is very, very stiff. Clearly there's been an acute fatigue response that has affected this muscle. We then measure the post-warm down, and we can see a return towards what they were before, but not fully. Now, does that mean the warm down's been ineffective? Have they not warmed down properly? Or actually, is that okay? Is that acceptable? Are we happy with that as a warm down? That it's moving the right direction, it's getting there, and maybe when they go, leave the venue, leave the pitch, and they rest, that's going to carry on the rest of the way before they need to compete again. Or maybe, having warmed down and got back to this stage, that's actually a better stage to be at for their race later in the day, for their next match, for the second half, if this is half-time. And what we do to look at that kind of picture is we look at our ranges again, our normal ranges, but these are slightly expanded. And what we talk about here is our individual athlete thresholds. So our thresholds here are where we would expect our athlete to fall. And these are for displacement. So, as Sergey said, you don't want to be too tight, you don't want to be too loose. You want an optimal level. So we want them to fall within here. We don't want them to be above, because that would be too loose. We don't want them to be below, that would be too tight. And you can see that different muscles, very different. Now, I've picked individuals that are relatively symmetrical here. It might be actually that you get individuals whose left side normally would be down here and right side would normally be up here. Okay? That wouldn't necessarily be desirable, but that might be how they operate. Some sports are very one-sided, very unilateral. Tennis players we might expect to be asymmetrical, and actually we might want them to be asymmetrical. We might want them to be stronger, better, faster, more powerful on their dominant side that they're doing the majority of the work on. Now, as I said, different muscles, different shapes, different thresholds, different places. The response of different muscles to the same exercise is not always the same either. We can see here, this is our same time points that we had before, a pre-warm-up, post-warm-up, post-race, post-warm down. And we've got the vastus lateralis and the bicep femoris at the top and the bottom show a very similar response. Post-race, we get this dip in displacement, this tightening of the muscle, this acute fatigue. Medial gastrocnemius actually responds very differently. We actually get this slight increase in displacement post-race. Now, the demands being placed on the gastrocnemius, on the plantar flexors, very, very different during a swimming race than the demands being placed on the hamstring and the quadriceps. So clearly, it's to be expected that the muscles will respond in a different fashion, even though it's all the same exercise that's being performed. Now, that helps us to plan out our warm-up protocols. It's again coming down this idea of one size doesn't fit all. It applies for muscles as well. Warming up the plantar flexors in the same way that you warm up the quadriceps or the hamstrings is not necessarily what you want to do when you're going to be swimming a race that's going to alter these muscles in a different way. And it's actually very rare to just swim one race in isolation within swimming. Normally you would have multiple events across multiple days, and we can track that across an entire weekend of racing. Generally, where we see these dips, that's post-race, okay? But we can see even here that left and right side don't always respond the same. We get dips occurring on the right side in orange that actually haven't occurred so much on the left side. So our individuals, not only different muscles, but the same muscle on different sides of the body are responding very, very differently. Now, this probably comes down to asymmetry that exists. And if we have a look at some normal range data again, we can see that the same muscle but on different sides might have a much bigger range on one limb compared to the opposite limb. That bigger range results from greater variability in the response of that muscle. And that greater variability probably comes about because there's greater demands and greater stresses being placed on this muscle than there is on its twin over on the other limb, which is probably because this is better toned, better conditioned, stronger, more powerful, faster. So in order to try and maintain that equilibrium of symmetry, in order to try and keep up, this one's always having to work much harder. You could think of it as the two friends, one with short legs and one with long legs. Short legs me, I'm having to run to keep up with big long legs over there. Okay, I'm working harder, but we're actually just covering the same distance. We're doing the same thing. We're walking from A to B, but I'm working so much harder because I'm not as well equipped, because my legs are short. Now, within our swimming squad, we do have levels of asymmetry. Now, these symmetry values are slightly different from what Sergey presented earlier. So here, our symmetry index, a value of 0 would be perfectly symmetrical. So the higher the value, the more asymmetrical the individual is. And some of the work that I've done in the lab has shown that individuals who are asymmetric in terms of their force production, their muscle function, in this case of the quadriceps group, their knee extensors, are more likely to show asymmetries in at least one of those muscles within the group, at least one of those heads. So, does that matter? Should we be trying to correct these asymmetries? And it's a question I get asked a lot, is less symmetrical better than more symmetrical? Is more symmetrical better than less symmetrical? Nobody ever asks, is less symmetrical better? Is more symmetrical better than less symmetrical? Is a decrease in asymmetry an improvement, or is it just a change? We measured one of our swimmers, particularly asymmetrical individual. We've got a range of muscles across the lower limb. A targeted S&C intervention was put in place to specifically try and counteract the asymmetries that we'd seen in this individual. 6 months later, we measured them again. 4 months after that, we measured them a third time. We can see that we've kind of plateaued a little bit here. So we got good increases, good response initially, somewhat plateaued, still going down in the bicep femoris. We completed the 12-month cycle by measuring them again 2 months later, and we can see that that asymmetry has been massively reduced, and we're now down below 20%, which, if you remember, Sergey, although the numbers were reversed, 20% or less was a value that we were interested in. That was the value we were aiming for. So we've managed to intervene here using the TMG as our objective marker to reduce the asymmetry. But has that been an improvement? We can't say categorically that it has, but I'd like to think so. And I'd certainly take the credit if he improves. So there's a whole host of people I need to thank. There's probably even more than that are on the screen. A lot of people involved in this study from Scottish Swimming, Scottish Hockey, Scottish Institute of Sport. We've been in partnership and collaboration, the university and the institute, for about 10 years now. I've been only a small part of that for the last 4 years. But Dr. Malcolm Fairweather needs a special mention as the pioneer, I would say, the head of special projects and innovation at the institute, who really got this up and running, worked really hard to integrate TMG into different sports, and brought me on board to front up that support network. So, all that's really left is to thank you all. Please do share your thoughts on social media. If you've enjoyed the presentation, I've been Lewis McGregor from the University of Stirling. If you haven't enjoyed it, I'm Danny Reuter. So, thank you very much.
I'd like to ask a question, if that's okay. From Malcolm Fairweather, I was at the BASIS conference last November, I think it was, and he mentioned that the system was being used at competition in swimming, which I thought was interesting, and in fact, apparently, had been taken to Rio. Could you talk about that? Would you know much about those two things?
So it didn't go to Rio, but it's been used widely in competition. As you can imagine, there's various logistical issues with trying to collect data on site at a swimming pool, at a competition, at a meet. And Sergey's demonstration will show you how easy the setup is, but imagine transferring this to the side of a swimming pool with thousands of swimmers all around, milling around. Now, where we have done it is in holding camps in preparation for Rio, as well as Glasgow Commonwealth Games in 2014. So in the final preparation stages, we've used it widely to inform the coaches exactly where those athletes are at that very sensitive time in their final preparations. One of the main reasons not to take it to Rio would be that within the sport there are certain athletes that do receive the support and certain athletes that don't. And in that kind of environment, it becomes a little bit sensitive about who's getting support and why, and who isn't getting support and why. We don't want to throw off anyone. So we measure up until the last possible minute, which effectively was the day before, or the day off? No, the day before the guys got on the plane to fly to Rio. So there were 4 athletes from Stirling in particular that I worked very closely with. The afternoon before they flew to Rio, we did a final round of testing, reported that really the previous 2 weeks, which was their final preparation stage, reported on that to the coaches, and they used that going forward to inform what then happened down in their holding camp before Rio and then at the competition itself. As I say, the mantra, if you like, that I always try to reinforce is that one size doesn't fit all, and a lot of coaches buy into that very well. Sometimes in an environment like the Olympics, with a head team coach, they want the whole team to be a team, and that to them means that everyone does the same thing. So there are again some issues to overcome, some obstacles to overcome in terms of convincing some coaches to treat each individual athlete like an individual. Swimming works slightly more easily because it is, on the whole, an individual sport, although everyone's representing a team. Sport like hockey, here's the ladies' hockey team at the bottom here, there's much more of an attitude that, well, we're all a team, we all do the same thing. Why? Why should a player who is 18 years old and covers an average of 7 kilometres in a match do exactly the same preparation for that match as an athlete who's 35 years old and covers an average of 4.5 kilometres in a match? Yeah, the demands being placed on different individuals are very, very different. And it's not just about the overall demands and the overall performance, it's also about their physiology, their natural muscle status. So, yeah, I guess I keep reiterating the point, but if there was a take-home message, then, one size does not fit all, and that's really, where tensiomyography fits in so well, because we can get down to what's under the hood, if you like. You can start to treat athletes almost like machines, almost like robots, like Formula One cars. Get into the engine, see how it works, and every single fine element can be honed and fine-tuned to optimise that performance of the individual, which then contributes to the team as a whole. So I kind of went off at a tangent there, sorry, but hopefully that...
Before I open it up, I just have one more. And before I ask you, I just want you to remember that there was a sheet that went around asking people for questions. When we receive that sheet, we will document all the answers to those questions, and we will circulate it to everybody that had actually contributed to the list with their contacts. Whilst I'm speaking, I'd just like to ask Sergey to start setting up the practical. We're in a time constraint. One of our visitors from Lithuania has to catch a flight, and two of our speakers have to catch a flight. So we're going to keep it rolling. So Sergey, if you wouldn't mind starting, just asking, we'll keep the questions going while you set up. So my question was, you started answering questions that I hadn't even thought of asking. So obviously you've gotten a long way into this situation, and to some degree a little bit overwhelming for somebody who may actually be looking at this for the first time. Have you any advice for people here today? And I'd like to sort of preface this by saying that this is being used in the UK reasonably extensively. In fact, in Leeds that I know of, I don't know that much about the Stirling situation, but in Leeds they have PhD students already put through on these units using this technology. So I'd just like to ask you, what would you suggest as a starting point for people who are sitting here today, keeping in mind we have people who are professors, senior lecturers, but also students, keeping that in mind with the answer for this.
Yeah, so as I kind of made the point, the first step has to be establish a profile of your athletes. Bank some data. And people sometimes say, what does a sports scientist do? And the joke answer is collects data. Well, to what end? That data needs to be used for something. So actually, with a relatively new piece of kit, a new piece of technology, you have to understand what it can and can't do. So banking that data without necessarily having a specific question in mind is actually quite valuable to begin with. Once you have a solid bank of data, a solid range of norms for your individual athletes, the questions you can answer are numerous, are limitless almost. What I would say is protect that data to an extent. Now, I don't mean by that keep it entirely to yourself, but be very careful about what you share with different individuals, with coaches, with physiotherapists, because they get ideas in their head and they start thinking about questions, and then before you know it, you've got a million questions to answer and you don't know how to answer them. So we were very strategic, very careful to make sure that we had a good solid bank of data. And we'd started to look at some questions. Some of the initial questions were looking at what levels of asymmetry exist within the squads. That was one of the first questions we approached. Once we had some answers there, we then started to share with the coaches. Here's what we've done. Here's what we've been doing. Now, the journey that I went on, particularly with swimming, was that, to begin with, the coaches accepted it. They were happy for it to happen. That was it. Can I come and test your swimmers? Yeah, of course you can, Liz. Do you want to know what I've done? No? Okay, fair enough. As soon as we'd started to share, and they started to understand what we were doing, there's now been a complete switch around where it's no longer, coach, can I test your swimmer? It's Lewis, can you test my swimmer for this? The coaches drive the questions. So some of the questions that I put up at the start are questions that I've possibly had in my mind, but a lot of those come from the coaches. The coach, when they start to see what you're doing and start to understand it, then says, so can I see if my athlete, after a training week which is power-based, is looking very, very different from a training week which is aerobic-based? Yeah, of course I can do that. We can measure that. We can look at that. We can start to get physiotherapists coming up with questions to answer. This individual has shoulder pain. Can we look at the muscles around the shoulder? Adductors, abductors, rotators. Can we see what is going on there? Is one side very different from the other? What might be causing those injuries, or that pain, rather? So I would say don't get carried away with the questions to begin with. Make sure that you have a solid bank of data, a solid understanding, and a solid sheet of profiles. Then the questions just form themselves. You never need to go searching for questions to answer. Questions will form themselves and will chase themselves. As I said at the start, I'm part of a collaboration between the Institute of Sport and Stirling University. And really my role is 50-50 within that, where for the university it's an academic position, it's about research output. For the Institute, it's all about athlete support. Now, if my research in the laboratory can feed into and inform what we're doing with the athletes, then that's great. That's half my job done. But also what we're doing with the athletes should lead into the research that we do in the lab. Because suddenly we're seeing things with athletes that we don't understand. Let's get it in a controlled environment. Let's bring it into the lab and let's test it in there and see how it works. So, again, another long-winded answer. Sorry about that, but hopefully that's kind of covered most of the points.
I'm going to open up to questions from yourselves. Just so you know, there is actually an international Tensiomyography organisation. They will actually be meeting at the next European College of Sport Sciences in their own subsection. So there is a bank of knowledge there that you can tap into if you'd like to look at this more closely. So if there's any questions, please. I'm not sure how to take that.
Means I've answered everything.
What is the standard that you have, for the TMG in terms of measuring? Because you did say that you bring in subjects, who come and then you give them training. If I'm a coach and I want to improve my athletes, right, I want a standard that is up there, right, so that my athletes will be able to follow. If you take football, for example, every country is different. You have some countries very fast, some slow, you understand, but that is very effective. So do you have data for each particular program with standard? And if so, how did you?
Yeah, so I guess Sergio might be better to answer that in terms of the database that exists. So yeah, there are databases for each sport, and then as I said, within our own squads, we then establish our own means and see how those compare. And maybe if there's differences, they're undesirable. Maybe if there's differences, we can understand those differences and we know why that is. And it might be something as simple as you suggested there. Genetically, let's say footballers from some countries will be more inclined or more predisposed to being very, very fast sprinters, very, very speedy athletes, whereas from other parts of the world, because of years of evolution, they're more equipped to be endurance-based, but actually the speed's not there. So measuring our squad from one nation, from one region, we might expect it to be very different from the standard that exists. But that's not necessarily a problem, as long as we understand why that difference is. I don't know if you want to.
So most of the subjects that are included in the reference values are from Europe, but of course not from the same race, because especially in football, we have, people from all over the world playing in top European soccer clubs. And also the level from some sport, the subjects are top level. In football, probably we have few thousand football players that are all from the first divisions from European leagues and Champions League and so on. So from that point of view, you have a big database with top-level athletes. So, you know, if you measure someone from Asia, of course, you probably would expect, especially if it's not a top-level club, the results to be slightly different. We'll try in future to make these reference values as specific as we can. But in order to do that, we need to have collaboration from our users. Sometimes it's a bit difficult because they are very protective about, you know, the results of an athletes that are worth so much. So yeah, basically what you get with the software, you get reference values for most of the sports that are, let's say, popular in Europe. Some reference values are from several thousand subjects, some are from, I don't know, 20 or 30. But like Luis said, you can build your own reference database as soon as you get enough subjects, and it will fit well into your own environment that you're working with. But it's a process. It's getting bigger and bigger with every new user. We're building the bigger database, and that's beneficial for all of us at the end.
Okay. So, sorry, was that a question?
Yes, it was. So I'm just interested in the data that you've collected, your TMG data, and the relationship that you've seen between it and performance outcomes or injury incidents and injury rates.
Sure. So, in terms of injuries, we've probably been fortunate that there haven't been a huge number of injuries, or the injuries that have occurred have been freak accident, that, you know, not muscle tears, strains, things like that are, you know, preventable, if you like, through training. That they're contact injuries and freak injuries, if you like. So in that sense, we're fortunate. I do quite often joke that it would be nice to get a few injuries because then we would be able to track them using TMG. But yeah, one of the key drivers, I suppose, within my work with the hockey team is that the coaches very much want to try and reduce injury risk as much as possible, and they certainly see that as the way forward with TMG. I've only been working with hockey for about 12 months, so in that period we've not really had enough time to establish, is there any kind of relationship between the measurements we're seeing and the injury risk and injury prevention. It would need to be more longitudinal for that. With swimming, again, it's not a sport that is highly susceptible to injuries, really. You know, repetitive strain type injuries and soreness, but not full-blown, you know, musculoskeletal injuries. In terms of performance, it's tricky. This is. I had a slide that I've used in the past, and anyone who watches South Park will know the analogy of the underpants gnomes. And their business plan is: step 1, collect underpants; step 2, step 3, make a profit. And it's almost the same. Step 1, measure with TMG or whichever physiological measure we have at our disposal. Step 2 is the big unknown black box, and step 3 is an improvement in performance. So there are so many branches and so many variables that contribute to performance, and then even assessing performance, I often say it's the only thing that matters, but it's the only thing we can't measure. Now, in a sport like swimming, you could say, well, we can measure performance because how fast did they swim? In a sport like hockey, it's very, very hard to measure performance. Maybe a player performed very, very well, but they were playing against a team that were far inferior. So actually quantifying that performance against the best team in the world is very, very difficult. So I always try to shy away from, when talking to coaches, linking the measurements with TMG to performance, because there's just too many variables and there's too much of a black box between what we can do and then what we can't do, which is performance. So we talk about controlling the controllables. As soon as the swimmer gets on the blocks or the player crosses the white line onto the field, our job's not over, but what we can control is over. We can't really affect much what goes on in that field, or in that pool or on that track. But we can make sure that stepping up towards that performance, we can get everything as appropriate as possible. I did have a video on here, and I got a feeling it's not going to play because it wouldn't play earlier. But actually, yeah, it's not coming up. Danny put the link on the publicity for this workshop. It's a video from one of the swimming coaches, Steve Tigg, and he speaks about exactly what you've just asked about does it affect performance? And his simple answer is, we don't know, but our performances have been good since we started using it, so we'll carry on. And that's kind of where we're at. We can't say that anything we've done that's been informed by the TMG has actually had a knock-on effect on performance. The example of the asymmetry I gave you, where we decreased that athlete's asymmetry, was it an improvement? Well, some people would say no, because it's just a lowering. It's not an improvement, it's just a change. Did it make them perform better? We don't know. They performed better that year than they did the year before, but how many hundreds of thousands of variables contributed to that improved performance? You know, what we did with the TMG was one small thing that actually might have been negligible. And that, I guess, is where my work in the lab, under controlled environments where we can isolate one individual variable, becomes more important. So the controlled work in the lab then informs what goes on with the athletes. But we only get that question by seeing something with the athletes that we want to test in the lab.